relationship counselor, Elizabeth Overstreet. Everyone has this vision in their mind of what marriage is, how romantic they want it to be, how they're going to raise their children, what the core values are going to be in that relationship. But often we don't tell each other totally what that vision is.
Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Bad Talks. I think this is going to be a very interesting show. Kay has a lot of energy tonight, so we will be...
All because of Bill.
He's very excited about our guest. Our guest tonight is Bill Mitchell. He hosts his own podcast called When Dating Hurts. We'll let Bill give more about the backstory of why he developed this podcast. And this subject is serious because the area that Bill does help people to address is when a relationship is unhealthy and how it can have pretty dire consequences. So, Bill, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking time to come out on our show tonight.
Yes, no, thank you for the invitation. It's really it's an honor, a pleasure to be here with you, to spend time with you. So, yeah, we can do a lot of good. Thank you.
Yes. So I want to start off by telling people a little bit, telling them a little bit about, what you do with your own podcast, how you go out and speak to people about, relationships and violence, and how that journey started for you.
Yeah, we got into this the hard way. We really did, because it started with a call on a Friday evening, a rainy Friday evening, from local detectives who then connected me with detectives in the Philadelphia area. I live in the Baltimore area. But I was on the phone, and I knew before I was put on the phone with them that a real horrible, life-shattering, devastating tragedy took place earlier that day when my daughter was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in her apartment. And the thing with her was she was 21, and she had just graduated 20 days earlier from college. And so we went to the graduation. We're very excited about that. And here we are 20 days later getting the worst news a parent could possibly get. So the following year was pretty much wrapped up in learning a whole lot about things we knew nothing about. A lot of phone calls with detectives, prosecutors, a lot of people like that, in and out of the courtroom several times. There are different steps that are involved, which I won't go into now, but we did see the guy who did it. Now, we saw him on graduation day too. So it was very strange to see somebody in May of 2005 and then 2 months later see him in the courtroom when they bring him in handcuffs and shackles and a dark blue jumpsuit. But anyway, 10 months after he killed our daughter, he was taken to prison. Now, he had spent time in jail all that time, but then he went to prison, and he's doing a 15 to 30-year stretch at this time. So he's done 17 of those. And so there are parole hearings, and there are things like that come along that are stressful. So, but anyway, somewhere in that first year, our family, my wife, my son, and I were asked to give a talk at a memorial service, and it went so well. People said so many strong things afterwards that it started making me think that we almost had this superpower where if we spoke with people, they would really listen about what happened with her and why it happened and everything. So I really went to work at learning as much about things like domestic violence, dating violence as I could. Over the course of time now, I've given somewhere around 200 speeches and interviews and different things like that. And then decided in 2015 to write a book about what happened, but also include with it advice as to how to detect an unhealthy relationship and then what to do if you were in one, or if somebody you care about is in one. So I did the book. The book didn't come out till 2020. It took a while to get it put together and get it perfect as far as I was concerned. And then I felt once the book was out that I wanted to do something else. And I started thinking about podcasts because I love podcasts. I just think it's a really great use of time if you're driving somewhere or you're working in the kitchen, but I just was so wrapped up in them, and I never pictured me doing that. But I got the courage to do it, and so I did, which also made it easier, by the way, later to do the audiobook version of my book. So I did it all, and I edited it and put it all together. So yeah, that's how we got to it. The book is called When Dating Hurts, as is the podcast, When Dating Hurts. And my website is whendatinghurts.com. So it's kind of easy to remember. But that's how I got through all of that and what I did. And here I am today with you. So it just gets better and better.
Yeah, so number one, like that's an incredibly difficult thing because I mean, you raise your child and they go to college, and that's such a monumental event that's happening, right? And you're like, okay, my child is finally set on
I
this
know.
path to
I know. It's
go
the
and live their
truth.
life, and then devastating thing happens. So that must have just took you and your wife to such a dark place. But it sounds like you really have utilized this time to really help others, which is really powerful, which probably has helped your healing in the process, and then writing the book as well. But she was young, and I think there's a lot of young women that sit in these situations, and young men. We don't talk about the fact that domestic violence happens on both sides, right? What
Yes.
as you talk to people, what are some early indicators? Because when you're young, you don't know sometimes what could look like extreme attention or extreme behaviors in a relationship, because you're still learning at that point how to be in a relationship.
Yeah, what happens is that what people feel oftentimes, for instance, what my daughter felt, which I didn't know much about this until afterwards, but I found that from her friends. But people like my daughter get into the relationships with people like the guy that did this, and they come to realize that, well, okay, it usually starts out being absolutely wonderful. And that's because a lot of people who do what this guy did, this sort of domestic violence perpetrating abusers, these people become quite practiced over the course of time with how to lure people in, how to groom them, how to manipulate them. And they know how to bring all the goodies. They'll have a really nice car, or borrow someone else's in his case and say that it was his car because it wasn't. But they will maybe take you out to eat morning, noon, and night. They might do that. They might take you to places you've never been before. If something happens that's unfortunate, they might buy you a nice gift. So there's this kind of wonderful fairy tale, usually in the beginning, maybe more so than the person who's going to later be abused has ever experienced before. And then what comes along is usually isolation. And the thing that's so insidious is that the people who have this happen don't get it. They just don't get it. They think that they're probably kind of in love with this other person, and this person is surely really nice. And then this other person kind of doesn't like some of your friends. So you think, well, I guess I'll kind of keep them away from those people, which means you have to kind of, for the most part, stay away yourself. So you kind of get dragged down that path. And then you start seeing these kind of power and control behaviors out of this other person. They start to want to take over. They want to kind of make decisions for you. Yeah, I don't really like your hair that way. You ought to wear it more this way. Or they might buy you clothes, which you think is like great, but they're really just dressing you up the way they want you to look. So there's that. Sometimes as it starts to get a little worse, there are put downs, or there a nickname you don't appreciate that you hear. And that's just to kind of put you in your place. Again, kind of power and control. I want you to understand, I'm the one running the show, not so much you. But you still think, wow, somewhere in the back of your head, you're thinking, it was really nice in the beginning. Some of what's going on now, I don't like so much. But it really was nice. And then maybe it's nice again for a while. And then the isolation gets a little worse. And then sometimes it starts coming through that there are kind of like threats. It may be a little bit veiled at times, but it might be like, look, when the guy says, in this case, I'll use the guy and the girl, because that's the most typical, and the guy being the abuser in this, but it would be like, look, I got to tell you, when you act like that, or when you say things like that, you remind me of my mother. And I couldn't stand it when my mother talked to me like that. So I really don't want you to talk to me like that. And the woman who is being somewhat abused and will be abused even more if she sticks around is thinking, wow, man, this guy's touchy in those areas. I better really act nice. I better do what he says. So you can see how the scale's tilting from what used to be wonderful to not so great. Maybe somebody who is always checking up on you, which you think is, wow, he really cares. But what he really wants to do, he wants to know where you are all the time. So lots of text messages, not just once in a while, lots of phone calls. My daughter used to be plagued by this guy with this stuff. Again, somebody directing or telling you what to do. And sometimes it gets worse. And sometimes what was almost like a feeling of threat of violence maybe becomes violence. I mean, like a punch or a push, or if it gets bad enough, strangulation, and all of us who maybe didn't have this happen to us in our lives look at these things and say, wow, bail out, get away from this person. What are you doing? But they don't. A lot of people just don't. Some do, but they usually stick around. And there are all these apologies, convincing apologies. Look, I lost my mind. It's never happened to me before. I don't know why I did that, but it'll never happen again. And usually immediately after that, we get back to the storybook romantic world that you were used to in the very beginning. You go to a nice place, he buys you a cell phone. Maybe he had smashed your other one because he didn't want you using it or something. But it kind of goes around and around. And so those steps are always the storybook romance. There's then more isolation. There are more threats of violence. Sometimes there's more violence or more frequent violence or worse violence, and then apologies. And sometimes the apology actually isn't an apology. Sometimes it's actually blaming the woman for, you made me do that. You said you'd make that meal a certain way, you didn't, and that's why I threw it. It's never that person's fault. But the person who's on the receiving end of it, the abused person, is just happy for there to be peace again for a period of time. And they kind of want to get back to those good days. But I know I've met people over the course of time since this happened to my daughter who stayed in relationships and stayed in marriages for 30 or 40 years with horrible things going on. Horrible.